Graham Hancock has been a controversial figure and point of interest for anyone involved in the conspiracy, history, and archaeological communities for the last 30 years. He's often shunned by mainstream historians and scientists for his alternative theories on ancient civilizations, from a lost advanced civilization dating back over 12,500 years to life previously existing on Mars. We'll get to that, but first let's go back before the controversy began. Graham was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in August 1950. Coming from a fairly well-off family, he grew up in India where his father worked as a surgeon. As a young man, he was interested in current affairs and the state of the world. And after graduating Durham University in 1973 with a degree in sociology, he worked as a journalist for many different British papers. In his last position as a journalist, he served as the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. It's while writing a story about wars in Ethiopia that his interest in ancient cultures would be ignited.
I flew into a city that at the time was in the middle of a war zone in a DC-3 that kind of dived down out of the sky to avoid the machine gun nests in the surrounding hills and landed in the airport. And this was an ancient city called Aksum, and it had incredible history. It had obelisks, it had a palace supposedly of the Queen of Sheba, had an ancient cathedral, the most ancient Christian cathedral in Africa dating back to 300 after Christ. And in the grounds of that cathedral, in a chapel, outside the chapel, I meet a monk, and he tells me in the conversation we have that he's got the Ark of the Covenant in that chapel. I had heard that the Ark of the Covenant was important to Ethiopia, but now I'm sitting in front of a monk with cataracts in his eyes, and he's telling me behind him in that chapel, but I can't go there, is the Ark of the Covenant. And I said, can I go? Can I see it? And he said, no, nobody can see it. Even the former emperors were never allowed to see the Ark of the Covenant.
In one of Graham's first books, The Sign and the Seal, it follows his journey through Egypt, Jerusalem, and Africa as he searches for the biblical artifact, the Ark of the Covenant, that Moses supposedly placed the Ten Commandments. The Ark is said to have been an ancient technology with mysterious powers that could wipe out armies of thousands of people in one go, and it perhaps had nuclear capabilities too. I plan to explore this in a future video, so make sure you subscribe if that sounds of interest to you. This early book and intrigue set out Graham's most famous book, The Fingerprints of the Gods, which went on to sell over 5 million copies. This is where Graham starts to gain critics in the historical and scientific community. Before we explore Graham's specific claims and theories, let me just quickly whiz through what the accepted by science views are on the history of our species. Neanderthals evolved into the human species during a cognitive revolution around 70,000 years ago, and spread from Africa through Europe and Asia. Humans would live as hunter-gatherers across the globe in tribes no larger than 100. 12,000 years ago, people started practicing agricultural techniques, changing the way that humans will live forever. With crops to look after, humans now needed permanent settlements for the first time. This step forward for civilization leads to a food surplus, causing populations to boom. The global population jumps to between 5 and 8 million in 1000 BC, then to around 250 million by 100 AD. This whole process allows humans more time to build incredible structures, practice creating more advanced tools, and the White Temple at Uruk is credited as being the first large pyramid structure built around 6,000 years ago. And there's a second temple that was built exactly on top of it, built around 5,500 years ago. This is probably the precursor to the Egyptian pyramids, the earliest of which dates back to around 4,600 years ago. These advancements are just the start to creations like money, law and order, and eventually cities. It's important to realize the people of Mesopotamia started settling and farming around 12,000 years ago. But they didn't become the complex society with the hierarchy, the ideology, the writing, the trade, the art, the architecture, and the dense population that would be required for a civilization to build these huge megaliths until around 6,500 years ago. So that leaves a 5,500 year transition period to get from farms and early houses to these megaliths. This is very much the accepted view and theory to this day. However, like Graham points out in the backbone to his argument, after the discovery and excavations of Göbekli Tepe in 1995, we now have a huge megalithic site dating back to around the same time that agriculture started. despite there being no evidence of settlements or agricultural sites near Göbekli Tepe. How could hunter-gatherers or newly recognised farmers create these massive structures? Stones weighing between 7 and 10 tons would be impossible for a hunter-gatherer to move around, let alone cut and carve. Well, this is what Graham explores. Graham believes a civilization far more advanced than we have ever imagined could have taught these stone cutting and labouring techniques to a hunter-gatherer tribe. Hence, the advanced production techniques used thousands of years earlier than we previously thought. But where could this tribe have come from? Well, Graham argues it could be from the lost city of Atlantis. The theory of Atlantis is a very well-known one and is first told by the Greek philosopher Plato in 360 BC. He writes about a society far more technologically advanced than any other at the time. Plato goes on to say that Atlantis reaches its demise around 9600 BC. The nation would be destroyed by the gods after they had excessively used a dangerous and supernatural power. As the story goes, in a single night, a giant cataclysmic event sent by the gods sunk Atlantis to the depths of the ocean. The mainstream historical view is that this story is just made up by Plato to make a political or philosophical point, but Graham would say otherwise.
And as we look into it further, we find something else, that Plato puts a date on the destruction of Atlantis. He says Atlantis was submerged beneath the waves in a huge global cataclysm 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That gives us an absolute date for this. We know Solon, we know who he was. Solon was a famous Greek lawmaker. He was an ancestor of Plato, as a matter of fact, about 200 years before Plato. And around 600 BC, Solon, the great Greek lawmaker, made a visit to Egypt. And in Egypt, the priests at a temple of Sais in the delta told him the story of Atlantis, and they said that it was written on the walls of the temple. And he said, when did this happen? When was this great civilization destroyed? And they said 9,000 years ago, and that was in 600 BC. So that's 9,600 BC in our calendar. That's 11,600 years ago. Plato is telling us a great civilization was destroyed in a global cataclysm of flood 11,600 years ago. He's laughed at by all academics and historians. But then geology comes along, and lo and behold, what do we find? 11,600 years ago is a truly cataclysmic episode in geological history. It's called Meltwater Pulse 1b. We have a massive rise in sea level as the ice sheets on North America and Northern Europe just crumble and collapse into the ocean. If Plato made the whole thing up, he was just astonishingly on the money with the latest geology. And I think that we really have to reconsider our attitudes to these stories that have come down to us from the past. Academics have been too quick to dismiss them, too quick to say, oh, we've figured the whole story out, there's no mystery there. Maybe there's a huge mystery there. Maybe we should listen to these clues and hints from the past that speak of a great civilization.
That brings us to the Meltwater Pulse B events and the Younger Dryas impact theory. The Younger Dryas was the last stage of the Pleistocene epoch, measuring from a period of 12,900 to 11,700 BP, in which the Earth was returned to a distinct cold period and then later a dramatic warming that preceded the warmer and more stable Holocene epoch in which society thrives today. In layman terms, it got really cold, 75% of all the world's megafauna went extinct, and then it suddenly became quite comfortable to live in again. Now, this event is not pseudoscience and is very much accepted by science to have definitely occurred. It's just, why did it occur? What caused the Younger Dryas? Now would be a great time to introduce one of Graham's friends. If you're interested in the subject, you'll already know him, Randall Carlson. Randall has dedicated large amounts of his life to understanding the Younger Dryas and specifically hypothesizing that a meteor impact was the cause, which is the hypothesis that Graham will go for. Graham and Randall are often ridiculed by scientists, and I'll explore that in more depth in a moment, but they do point to troves of evidence and data points to support their hypothesis. Such things like a spike in platinum all over the world, which is commonly found in asteroids around the same period as the Younger Dryas. Also an ash layer known as the black mat, which is also seen around the globe, also from the same period as the Younger Dryas. And there's many more data points and pieces of evidence that become way more complex. But if you want to know more about this subject, then just listen to a Randall Carlson lecture, and he'll have an abundance of information that, if you're anything like me, might be a bit hard to take in at times. Graham uses Randall's research as further data to support his point that an uber-advanced society was wiped out by a dramatic event and traces of these people destroyed. Graham also uses evidence on the Sphinx in Egypt to claim that these advanced people that were here many years before we previously thought perhaps built the Sphinx.
So what you're looking at behind me, of course, is the erosion. This is limestone, probably an ancient seabed. And the erosion, you would think, would have been the result of wind, blowing sand over the course of, say, a few thousand years to do that. But Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University, who is an expert on the weathering of stone, has stated for many years that this is the result of precipitation. This weathering is from water. So as you can see, it's a desert now, but 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, it was savanna, it was grasslands, maybe even tropical. So this weathering means that this was actually carved out, that this work was done at least 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and that dates the Sphinx at being 8,000 to 10,000 years old.
I think it's more than fair to say that to construct the Sphinx, you would need a complex structure and hierarchy in your society with a great idea of planning, let alone the right tools. The accepted science says the Sphinx was built between 2558 and 2532 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Khafra. The face of the Sphinx is meant to resemble Pharaoh Khafra. There is, however, no hieroglyphic evidence that Khafra constructed the Sphinx, so this is just largely speculation. Interestingly though, we have records from a Greek historian, Herodotus, about the construction of the pyramids. He spent his life travelling to Egypt to gain knowledge through the locals. Herodotus' account from 500 BC dates the pyramids back to the same point modern day scientists say the pyramids were built, around 2550 BC. The same as the Sphinx. However, interestingly, Herodotus doesn't mention the Sphinx while recording this data, he only mentions the pyramids. So perhaps he didn't actually know when the Sphinx were built. Graham argues that the Sphinx was built by a previous generation, thousands of years before the construction of the pyramids. Evidence brought to light by John Anthony West, an independent Egyptologist, points out that weathering on the walls of the Sphinx could only be a result of rainfall during a wet period. Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology, agrees with this theory, dating the last wet period in Egypt back to between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, making the Sphinx at least 7,000 years old. 3,000 years older than previously thought.
My first impression of the Sphinx was, now that I saw it on the ground, in person, there was something wrong with the Egyptological dating. Because when you look at the Sphinx, as a geologist with a geological eye, this was not weathered by wind and sand. This was not desert erosion and weathering that I saw on the Sphinx.
Now, those points are the basis of a lot of Graham's claims and alternative theories that are often laid out as just being pseudoscience. But Graham doesn't stop here. In his 1999 book, The Mars Mystery, he explores a similar theory just happening on Mars. He claims an asteroid transformed the surface of Mars from a lush planet with rivers and oceans into a bleaky, icy hell. He then explores the ideas of an advanced Martian civilization who built huge megaliths, with this satellite image showing a sphinx-like head emerging out of the planet's surface. So this now feels like a good time to start looking at Graham's critics. It doesn't take long to find critics of Graham online. They seem to be everywhere when you search his name, and they put a lot of effort into disputing his claims. Let's start with Graham's furthest reach here, the theory of the Martian people. And this piece of evidence, the megaliths poking out of Mars's surface. Well, this one is quite easily discredited or explained by a phenomena called pareidolia. Pareidolia is the tendency to see objects, patterns, and meanings when there isn't one. Just like when you look up at the clouds and you might see something that looks like a face, or seeing faces and figures in tree lines. This is pareidolia. However, Graham's explanation is that this evidence is of an ancient civilization on Mars whereas the pareidolia explanation is not only simpler, but a lot more evidence-based, especially when you look at the more up-to-date HD images from the same spot taken just a few years later. While it might seem really discrediting just to throw out alternative theories because they're more complex, this is common practice in science philosophy. You may have heard of Occam's razor. It's a filter or a razor used to cut out certain theories. Occam's razor states that among a certain set of hypotheses equally supported by evidence, the one which makes less assumptions is most likely to be true. This is the biggest reason scientists refute Graham's work. He simply too often makes assumptions amongst his evidence. Another point people often refute is the notion that a civilization as advanced as the one proposed by Graham would leave some sort of trace, be it tools, pottery, clothing, or even garbage. However, I find this point weak, as Graham would explain, you won't find any artifacts in the world had this apocalyptic style wipeout scenario via a meteor taken place. And with the fairly recent discovery of Göbekli Tepe and the possible true age of the Sphinx, these could easily date society back to this time. But again, we come to Occam's razor. Too many assumptions here. Another critical point is the lack of an impact crater. For this reason, the Younger Dryas impact theory gets dismissed. Scientists explained the Younger Dryas through a shutdown of the North Atlantic conveyor, which circulates warmer water from the southern hemisphere north, causing this water to evaporate and then warm the northern hemisphere. When this conveyor stops, it makes the northern hemisphere bitterly cold, causing the cooling. Lining up with the Younger Dryas is also a mass extinction event of megafauna. Now, the seas shifting wouldn't be enough to cause this mass extinction event, so scientists hypothesized this mass extinction event was caused by overhunting, which to me seems a little far-fetched. 75% of the world's megafauna, all these species from different parts of the world, would go extinct at once due to hunting. However, I can think of something that could have that effect on a huge number of different species all around the world. In 1999, the BBC made a documentary of Graham, titled Atlantis Uncovered. To Graham's surprise on release, while watching for the first time, the doc was made as a hit piece, set out to discredit his reputation. He ended up taking his complaint to the Broadcast Standards Commission in the UK, who ruled the documentary was unfair on Graham, and they were actually forced to re-edit. However, something I found when I was reading people's criticisms of Graham's work, that so many people seemed angry and they had the frequency to personally attack Graham. This author starts his debunking stating some of his ideas were consumed while experiencing hallucinogenic drugs, and that Graham describes those drugs as enlightening. Well, that's just not very nice. This person can't decide what is and isn't an enlightening experience for another human being, and I'm sure they probably haven't done these hallucinogenic drugs themselves to even be a judge. This is a common attack on Graham, making him out to be some crazy drug addict who's just obsessed with all different conspiracy theories. But I just find this view foolish. People will also refute Graham for admitting his mistakes and altering his theories, like it's some kind of gotcha. If we go back to ancient Egypt and the pyramids for a second, and you remember how the Greek historian Herodotus credited Pharaoh Khafra for building the second and third of the pyramids? Well, if we go above the largest pyramid, the Great Pyramid, above the King's Chamber, we have the only traces of ancient writing inside the pyramid. These writings give the royal name Khafra, Khafra's father, who built the first and the largest of the pyramids, lining up nicely with the evidence from Herodotus. However, in 1983, author Zachariah Stitchin claimed that these marks were forged by the team of British explorers who first discovered them in 1837. This idea has been largely debunked. However, in Fingerprints of the Gods, Graham claims that there is a certain smell hanging over these hieroglyphs and refers to them as dubious. Back then, Graham claimed that the pyramids were pre-12,000 years ago, hence removing the attribution with a pharaoh from 4,500 years ago. In his next book, Keeper of Genesis, he repeats Stitchin's claim that the forgers made mistakes while forging these hieroglyphs that an ancient Egyptian would have never made. However, in 1998, Graham nobly withdrew these claims, admitting the pyramids were probably built in 2500 BC, but still holding firm that the Sphinx is a lot older. This is another common attack on Graham, that he makes claims and then uses evidence of someone else making that claim with no evidence as his evidence. However, I feel like you have to credit Graham for admitting mistakes and altering his theories when new evidence is presented to him. It shouldn't be used as some kind of gotcha by his critics. I think Graham is a very interesting man. The way he articulates this information is second to none. While I can see where a lot of the critics come from about many of his claims, as time goes on, Graham's claims have only gotten more foolproof and a little more realistic. Yes, he is quick to jump to conclusions to support his theories. However, to laugh at him and mock him and attack his character, like I've seen so many times while researching his critics, is extremely disingenuous. These are events that happened 12,000 years ago. While science and geology can give us theories, no one truly knows what caused the Younger Dryas, who built the Sphinx, and even if there was ever a past Martian civilization. At the very least, Graham is highly captivating and entertaining. To me, it's fun to have a little bit of wonder, and hey, it's not like science has never been wrong. I leave you with a few words from Graham. Thanks for watching.
If you live in one of the great technological cities of the modern world, you almost never see the stars. Light pollution cuts out the sky, severs our connection with the universe. But if you look down from a NASA satellite, you can see here, for example, Northern Europe, lit up like a golden string of jewels. But down here is the Sahara Desert, inhabited by hunter-gatherers. It's completely dark because there's no electricity there. And the Namibian Desert, again inhabited by hunter-gatherers, completely dark because there's no electricity there. This is often taken as a symbol of the technical advancement of the industrialized societies. But let's think about that a little bit. Go west and there's North America, lit up like a string of jewels. But there's the Amazon jungle, completely dark because there's so little electricity there. And actually in the state of Acre, in the southwestern Amazon, where those geoglyphs have recently been found due to clearances, there are still tribes who remain uncontacted by our civilization. They don't even know we exist. Goodness knows what they think when they see a helicopter circling overhead, taking photographs of them. They never knew about our culture before, and suddenly there's these strange beings in flying machines overhead. But we have to ask ourselves, who would survive if something like the Younger Dryas cataclysm were to happen again in our day? If those cosmic impacts were to strike the 21st century world, who would survive it? I do not believe that it would be the inhabitants of the advanced industrialized civilizations. We are the spoilt children of the earth. We are used to having everything at our fingertips. The supermarket shelves stuffed to overflowing with food, roofs over our heads, clothes on our backs. We can go anywhere in the world we like. We consider ourselves to be the masters of the universe. But you stop that food supply into the cities, and it's a just-in-time food supply right now. There's only 2 or 3 days food supply in any city. You stop that food supply into the cities, and I would suggest within a matter of weeks, our much vaunted civilization would begin to fall apart. The psychological trauma would be massive. People would not be prepared for it in any way, and very few of us, there are exceptions, but very few of us know anything about survival at all, because we depend entirely on a complex interrelated network of skills. Who would survive? Who would survive would be the hunter-gatherers in the Namibian deserts, in the Amazon rainforest, because they're in the business of survival. That's what they do every day. They are absolute masters of survival. They would weather such an incident with very little damage, and it would be they and their descendants who would carry forward the human story. And I like to imagine how it might be told 12,000 years from now, how there might be a myth that the archaeologists of that time would dismiss as complete nonsense. How there was a myth that told of a time when there was an advanced civilization on this planet. They were so advanced, they were almost gods. They had supernatural powers. You know, they could look at a little device and speak to one another, even see one another on opposite sides of the planet. They could fly around the earth. They could send people to the moon. But they became corrupt. They became cruel. They became conceited and big-headed. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation. They imposed their powers on other less powerful people around the world. And the universe wouldn't put up with that. The universe struck them down. It's our choice. Let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization. Thank you.